So we are now in our briefing session with representatives from Trust for Public Land and FM3. And for the record, for those in the room, please state their name.
Diedrich Allen.
Monty Ritter.
And voice.
Jeff Rabel.
Mark Ziegler.
Arvilla Oldie.
Neil Winters.
Frank Pitcher.
Jeff Chu.
David Metz.
And Dee Frankfurt. Timmy Jeffries.
And Randy Fetterburg.
Well, welcome. And here we are, the final results.
At long last.
Long last.
So thank you very much, commissioners. I thought I would run through a little thumbnail of the history of the process here. This has been in the works with a prior board of county commissioners for over 5 years, when you requested our technical advice and assistance to help explore the possibility of dedicated funding for land and water conservation funding in Mason County. That was renewed. At that time, we were still in the recession. Your former colleagues opted not to poll. Actually, Dave Metz and FM3 was the polling firm that had it drafted, and then the commissioner said, no, let's wait. So you renewed that in September of 2014 with the two of you and Commissioner Sheldon, again requesting our technical advice and assistance. And then our research team and I presented a little over a year ago the feasibility report to the county on what your funding options could be. And then it was 2 months ago in April that we finally did the polling. And it's here today that we are presenting the results of that public opinion survey. And just for the full information, the consideration that you asked us to drill down in this was creation of a Metropolitan Park District countywide. I know we've had subsequent conversations, and I've asked Dave to tease out some of the interest. You had Commissioner Netherland, which we can engage in that discussion. And realizing that we were looking at a countywide MPD, even though there is in existence since 2010 a Shelton, City of Shelton MPD. And Mark's here to hear that information for the countywide, realizing we didn't know if there did show sufficient support, if there would, what that merging might look like, or whether the city was even interested. What we wanted to do and what we endeavored to do all the time through the public opinion survey is to understand what the electorate is interested or not interested in doing. So that's the purpose of coming here today. We also, even though state law allows up to 75 cents per $1,000 of assessed valuation for an MPD, we tested for Mason County 20 cents. 20 cents would have yielded a million $1.4 million a year. So
And that's with the tax base and Shelton.
no, that was countywide. That would have included the tax base in the city as well. So
Currently, how much are they still collecting in Shelton? Because that's been going down.
Mark, do you want to respond to that?
I don't know the exact, rate, excuse me, off the top of my head and what that is equivalent to now. I know that we're collecting about $300,000 at this point annually. So what that equates to,
I can look it up, please. Because let's see if there's the 20, because that number keeps dropping on what they're allowed.
32 cents, wasn't it?
Based on the proration, correct?
Yeah,
It's
so we're
dropping.
about 32 cents currently, so. And I'm hearing that may still continue to go down, that's fine.
So with that preface of this survey was countywide, to understand what the information and what the priorities and what the so-called tax tolerance and interest was of these kind of issues. That's what we worked together to create private funding, which is what brings us here today. So.
All right, so with that, we'll dive in. I'm going to walk through a series of slides which highlight a variety of key results from the survey. I realize it's a small screen, and I'll try to be descriptive if some of you in the back
For
can't
us,
see
that's a
well.
huge screen. We were so excited. Matter of fact, it got won. Somebody won it. That's how we.
Sweepstakes, folks, that's where that came from.
Seriously. Welcome to Mason County.
All right. I also have, in addition to what I'm showing you today, I have this big, thick phone book full of data where we took every question in the poll and broke out the results by a variety of different demographic and geographic subgroups, so we can dig into some of those details if it's helpful for your consideration. Just to start off with, a brief review of the methodology we used for the survey. We talked to just over 300 voters in Mason County who are considered, based on their past voting behavior, likely to cast ballots in this November's election. That included an oversample of voters to get us up to 50 total interviews in the city of Shelton, so that we would have a little more confidence in what that subgroup thought relative to the
When you're
others.
saying oversampled, the 50 out of the 301 or on top of the 301?
Out of the 301.
So the percentage is, okay.
Yeah, and then once we got the data back, we statistically weighted it so that the responses from the city were in the correct proportion of the overall countywide electorate. Just means that when we look at the results for the city itself, we have a little more confidence in what we're hearing than we would if we had a smaller sample on the national. The interviews were done beginning of April on both landlines and wireless phones, which is obviously important these days to make sure that we're getting a representative sample. And the overall margin of error here is just under 6%. For some of the subgroups we'll show you, the margin of error is a little bit higher. But overall, most of the numbers, 5.7%. So, just to start out, a little bit about the overall mood of voters in the community. We asked people whether they thought things in the county are headed in the right direction or off on the wrong track. For those who reside in the city, we asked them the same thing about the city. And as you'll see here, the sentiments that we got overall are relatively mixed. For the county, it was 45% who said right direction. It's missing a label there, but 29% said they thought things in the county were off on the wrong track. For the city, 44 to 35. Not atypical responses these days. The mood of the country, when you ask the same question, only about 16% think the United States is headed in the right direction. So people feel
How much was wrong? What was
29, 45 to 29. So people feel better about how things are going at the local level than they do nationally, but there's still obviously some mixed feelings, and a lot of that is driven by the economy. We also asked people to indicate how they felt about a variety of different local public agencies that might be involved in managing funding for parks and recreation, including the County Parks Department, which was overwhelmingly viewed favorably. 57% said they had a positive impression of them, just 9% unfavorable. The Board of County Commissioners, 33 to 26 favorable, and then the Shelton City Commission, 23 to 19. The gray bars represent the proportion who either said they hadn't heard of them or didn't know enough about them to offer an opinion. So essentially a neutral response. These responses, when you're talking about getting additional funding for public services, are generally positive. You've got more people who feel good about local government than have negative feelings, which is helpful. It's not overwhelming when we're talking about county or city government, but these days, again, the public's feeling about government, period, is not terribly high, so this is generally a positive
Ever see
sign.
high percentage ratings for government? How things are going?
The more local we get, again, the more positive it is, but these days it's rare that they're overwhelmingly positive. In very small, very affluent communities it is, but that's about it. Now we also asked people to indicate their concern about a variety of issues facing Mason County. We read them the list of issues you see on the screen here and then asked them to rate each one as either an extremely serious, very serious, somewhat, or not too serious problem in Mason County. So the columns running down the right-hand side are the total proportion that rated each of these items either an extremely or very serious problem. They're ranked by the sort of darker orange bars on the left-hand side, which is the proportion that called each of these an extremely serious problem. So the first thing you'll note is that basically, other than the economy, people are generally pretty happy with the way things are going. Whether we call it jobs and unemployment, whether we call it the condition of the local economy, that's an issue that a majority of local voters are rating as a very serious problem. Everything else is under 50%. You do have about 2 in 5 who say that waste and mismanagement in county government is a concern. And again, I wouldn't take that too personally. We can ask that about just about any layer of government, and that's something where we're seeing a high level of public concern these days. But again, something to keep in mind when we're talking about potentially asking people to increase their taxes. They want to have confidence that the money is going to be spent appropriately. Relatively low levels of concern about taxes per se. Only 1/3 of voters say that the amount they pay in local taxes is a very serious problem right now. On the flip side, rather than just asking people what issues concern them, we also had a question where we read them a list of a variety of services that might need additional funding, and then asked them to tell us how great a need they perceive for additional funding in each of these areas. The dark green bars on the left are the proportion who said there's a great need, the light green is some need, and those two numbers are totaled running down the right-hand side. So you'll see that at the top of the list we've got roads and highways, public schools, and the police department as the items where they see the greatest need for additional funding. Issues relating to conservation, to parks and recreation tend to be lower on the list. There are still majorities who are telling us they see at least some need for additional funding in most cases, but potentially with a little bit lower level of intensity. It is striking to compare the results of this slide with the previous one. Here we're looking at the intensity of concern about problems, and only about 1 in 5 say that any of these are extremely serious problems. But then looking at the intensity of feeling about the need for additional funding, much higher. There's larger proportions who are telling us there is a great need for funding for each of these services. So despite the fact that people are not necessarily feeling a burning dissatisfaction with a lot of these conditions or aspects of the quality of life in Mason County, there still is a recognition that additional dollars could be put to good use in addressing it. So all of that feeds into the basic support for the funding concept that we asked people about in the survey, which is the formation of a countywide Metropolitan Park District, as Dee described a few moments ago. Now, when you're measuring support for a potential ballot measure in our industry, the most objective way to gauge that support is to, at the very beginning of the survey, read people a model of the actual language they would see on the ballot, where they're asked to vote yes or no. Through a lot of research, hundreds of polls that the Trust for Public Land has been involved in over decades, that factor has the single strongest correlation with how people ultimately vote. At the end of the day, they may not read the newspaper, they may not look at any of the mail that gets sent to them, they may not read the ballot pamphlet, but they all will be staring at that ballot before they send it in. So the wording of that language is particularly important. And so we worked with TPL and their experts to craft a model of the ballot language that met all of the legal standards it's required to meet, but also based on past research, we thought would be one that voters were receptive to. And you'll see that 20-cent tax rate that we settled on mentioned prominently in the language as well. So given that language, at the beginning of the survey, 55% of voters told us that they would vote to approve it, 40% told us that they would vote to reject it. So the good news here is that's majority support. It's over the threshold that would be required for approval. At the same time, we note that it is just over that margin, and it's frankly within the margin of error of that 50% threshold. The other thing to note is that it's basically dead even among those who feel most strongly about the issue. If you look at the dark green bar on top, the proportion who say they would definitely approve it is about the same proportion as the dark orange bar at the bottom, the 27% who say they would definitely vote to reject it. So we certainly have seen lots of measures be successful with this profile of support, but it does indicate that you would really need to have a strong campaign effort behind it. Good consensus of community support and an effort to firm up the backing of those who are in those second two categories, who say they probably vote to approve it or are leaning in that direction. They're for it, but they have some uncertainty, some hesitation that keeps them from fully committing. Now, to give you a sense of how some different subsets of the community reacted to this concept, the next few slides break out responses to this initial question among a number of different subgroups. You can, for each of these, the dark green bar represents the proportion of that group who said they'd vote yes, the orange is no, and then the gray is the undecided. So not a lot of difference inside and outside the city of Shelton, basically a high 50s vote in each location. By commissioner district, the strongest support is in District 2, although again, given the subsamples here, that's technically within the margin of error. There's about a 10% margin of error for each of the commissioner districts, but we've got majority support in each of the three.
You got 10% margin?
Yeah,
You jumped in.
within
That's
the districts.
numbers, okay.
Yeah, because we're looking at smaller subsets. Now, where people start in terms of their support for the ballot measure concept is obviously only one factor. We also want to understand how their opinion shifts as they're exposed to the kinds of things that supporters and opponents might say over the course of the campaign. So we walk people through a series of statements, some from supporters, some from opponents, to see the degree to which people's level of support shifted. And you'll see that giving people the positive statements, the reasons to vote yes, did open up a slightly larger margin in favor of the measure. We go from 55% approval to 56%. The rejection drops from 40% down to 38%. And then the negative statements, after we went through reasons to oppose it, support tightens notably down to 50-45. We still have a majority that are in favor, but it's a much more narrow majority after they've heard the pros and cons. So that gives you a sense of the overall fluidity of support. What I'll show you now are some of the follow-up questions we asked people to understand how they viewed both some of the moving pieces that might be part of a measure, the rate, how the money might be used, and then also how they react to some of the individual reasons for support and opposition that we spelled out.
One of the negatives, did you read anything, Jim, that said that the tax could be as high as 75 cents?
We'll get to the negatives we walk through in just a minute.
I remember
We
that
tested a variety of
That
rates.
killed something else years back. The total number was used by the public, not the number they intended to use.
Which is one of the reasons, Commissioner, we put the 20 cents in the ballot language, because I think we saw this as a problem in Seattle as well, a couple of years ago when they wanted to create an MPD, and the city council opted not to put in a specific amount. So it could be up to the full amount, and it's problematic because voters want to know what they're voting on.
Yeah, I'd like to see what that language looks like. Sometime if you can just email it to me. The
This-
language that specifies the amount.
It was in there.
That's it.
It was in the
No,
slide.
no, but does that restrict it by law, is the question.
If you say 20 cents in the ballot initiative,
Yeah, it
you've
would-
locked in the 20 cents.
Yes, you would be. And then but as Mark knows, in the Shelton, it's a junior taxing district,
It goes
so
backwards, yeah,
it can be
back.
squeezed, but that's its upper limit. We're working with Eastmont and East Wenatchee as well, and
So if you wanted to raise that, you'd have to go back to the
yes, yeah, you would be locked into. But what Seattle did was they were silent on the property tax, and that was an Achilles heel. I mean, it only passed in Seattle 2 years ago with, I think, 54%. So it was, anyway, it's why we, at the Trust for Public Land, propose that you, in full disclosure to the electorate, look at what your needs are, and that's why we tested, and they will show the different levels of support. But this would lock you into 20 cents at the ceiling.
Thank you.
All right, so looking at structural elements of the measure, there is, not surprisingly, a fair amount of cost sensitivity in terms of the impact of the measure. Obviously, we mentioned the rate in the ballot questions we just discussed, but for a lot of the voters, they may not necessarily know exactly what that equates to in terms of a total annual cost on their tax bill. So we have a follow-up question where we asked people how they would vote if they knew it would cost the average homeowner a variety of different annual costs. And you can see how the level of support shifts. We have majority support for amounts that are under $30 per year per household, actually relatively high majority support, 59% who said they'd vote to approve it, 37% who said they'd vote to reject it. We drop below that majority once we get up to amounts of $36 or $43 per year.
And the $29 per year is essentially, at least when we did the research a year ago for you all, is the 20 cents per $1,000 assessment.
Saved my work.
And the $36 per year is 25 cents. And the $43 is 30 if we went to 30 cents per year. All of which are considerably less than what Shelton currently
What was that
voted
number?
on.
Frank, did you get that number?
Their assessment is at .2765883, but it's been brought down because they're a junior district, and I don't know what that dollar, what that percentage is. I'd have to call the assessor for
Well, that would be just minus our buy down, which will occur next year, so they're at .27. 27 cents is what they're still using. That's what it sounds like, is that accurate?
that. That is the,
Yeah.
that is the rate, and then it's brought down.
But you voted in 55 cents.
Well, yeah, that's.
The max
that
is
doesn't matter,
55, that is
Yeah.
correct.
Right,
She just said,
Yeah, 'cause,
yeah.
she knows
well, and
that.
I'm thinking about the whole, if we did a whole district with the city of Shelton, then that's gonna be a limiting factor for any future things. If it starts to go down below 27, there's still some room for a few years.
Now, the good news out of this is, as Dee said, if that $29 is equivalent to the 20-cent amount we asked people about before, their initial support was 55%. Telling them what the actual cost is actually causes the support to go up a little bit, to 59%. So it suggests that their mental math of what the cost impact of that 20 cents per thousand might be leads them to think it's more than what we're actually telling them there. For some people, they're hearing that figure as a relief. And also note at that $29, the gap between the dark green and the dark orange bars, which were basically dead even when we started on the ballot question, we now have more people who say they would definitely vote to approve it, as opposed to saying they would definitely vote to reject it.
Do you remember what the average home rate we had at that point?
250,000.
Was that what she used, 250?
We used 142.7,
Did you?
yeah. Countywide. Yeah.
I saw the footnotes somewhere.
We see low numbers.
Now, in relation to the Shelton District, we asked people to tell us, we gave them the information that Shelton has a district that was created in 2010, that the one option would be to merge that existing city district into the countywide district, and then ask people to tell us whether they would be more likely or less likely to support the measure if they knew that it would include that district in Shelton. Now, I should caveat this to begin with. Imagine we're catching your average voter on a Tuesday night. They're cooking dinner. Their kids are running around in the background. They have no idea how parks are financed. They don't know what a park district is versus what county government or city government is doing. And now we're asking them to imagine the potential merger of these districts they don't know a whole lot about. So while we see a positive reaction here, 50% to 31%, I think we have to concede that for a lot of voters, this is a level of specificity that is probably far beyond what they have thought about before. And so the numbers who tell us they'd be much more likely or much less likely to support it are probably the ones that deserve the greatest weight. The ones who only have more passive feelings probably, this isn't something that's a real deal breaker for them. I would also note that we saw very similar numbers within the city of Shelton and outside. In Shelton, by a 51 to 28 margin, voters told us they'd be more likely to support it if the districts were merged. In the balance of the county, it was 49 to 31. So statistically identical numbers inside and outside Shelton. Then we offered the respondents a list of different specific ways that money raised by a park district might be put to work. and we asked them to prioritize these projects on a 4-point scale as either extremely, very, somewhat, or not important. Again, we got the top 2 categories running down the right-hand side there. The first 3 items you see listed are ones that bear particular attention because more than 50% of voters are telling us these are things that are very important to them to see funded. And obviously 50% is the proportion that would need to vote to approve it. So providing youth recreation programs, protecting land around creeks and streams, and preserving natural areas all have constituencies that are larger than half of voters, seeing them as somewhat urgent. And I will note that in general, those are some of the items that we typically see score high on surveys like this. In particular, a connection between protecting land and the benefits it has for water quality tends to matter to voters. Youth recreation programs is a little bit higher here than what we see elsewhere. It's usually not the #1 item on the list, although it does tend to be in the top tier. Preserving natural areas also tends to score highly. The numbers that rank lower down are pretty similar to what we often see, which is specific facilities for active recreation, including trails, tend to rank as lower priorities with the public at large in relative terms. I would note that there's almost nothing on this list that voters are dismissing out of hand. The dark orange bar is the proportion who label any of these not important. And so there's nothing here that even more than 1/3 of voters are saying, no, that doesn't matter to me. It's just a question of the intensity of the sentiment that they have. So some of those uses for active recreation often tend to be a little bit lower down on the list. And as we get to the second tier here, you'll see that the numbers do drop off precipitously, and there's a handful, a shooting and archery range, kayak launch areas, horseback riding trails, where we do have majorities telling us they're not important. Perhaps not surprisingly, those are obviously very focused forms of recreation facilities that probably only relatively small subgroups are using on a regular basis.
Dave, what I might add here is what we wanted to do, since you had your Parks and Trails master plan, was to take some of those individual elements and test them in a statistically valid survey, and that's what we did. And then there's, I think, a third slide as well. Oh, no, just those 2.
Yep. All right, so the final section deals with the messages that we tested. These are arguments for or against a measure. You'll recall I showed you before how the numbers moved as voters heard the pros and the cons. Here's the information on the specific items that we tested. First, we're looking at arguments in favor of a potential measure. And they're presented here in the rank order that voters rated their persuasiveness. I'll show you the specific numbers in just a few moments. But some of the top items that we saw on the list included protecting local water quality, helping to support the local economy through tourism, leaving a legacy for future generations, and then ensuring that money is spent in an accountable way. And all of those in their own way tie back to some of the previous survey results we've looked at. We saw that investing money in ways that benefit water quality was important to voters. We saw that the condition of the local economy was the issue that most voters were concerned about relative to other things. And we saw that there was a fair amount of concern about potential for waste and inefficiency in public spending. A lot of those messages tie back to those other voter concerns. Leaving a legacy for future generations, we always see when we're talking about parks or conservation, is a very powerful motivator for voters as well. Here you'll see the lower tier of messages that we tested. It's not that voters had a negative reaction to these, but they were significantly less compelling as reasons to vote yes. And a lot of them have to do with things that are about the process of how money is raised and spent as opposed to the outcome that it ultimately produces. Getting matching grants, noting that this is dedicated funding for parks, increasing access to the water, talking about the Shelton MPD, things like that, just overall were a little bit less compelling to voters. And here you'll see the numbers for each of those messages I just showed you. The dark green bar is the proportion that said these were very convincing reasons to vote yes. The light green is the somewhat convincing. Typically we're looking for messages ideally that get up to 40%, telling us they're very convincing. And the best here fall a little bit short of that standard, although the top 4 that we highlighted on that first slide all have at least 30% rating them as very convincing. And you'll see there's a wide range here that more than 3 in 5 voters call at least somewhat convincing.
So when you say you like to look at C40, so that you have confidence in spending your campaign dollars on that
Right.
message.
And then it's something that's got some urgency to it, right? Some people aren't just saying, yeah, it sounds good, but like, yes, I strongly agree with that.
Okay.
So we also looked at the other side of the coin, which is reasons to vote no. And you'll see here the arguments against a measure that we tested. Now, keep in mind, what we're trying to represent here is the kinds of criticisms that might get made, whether they tell the whole story, whether they're fair or not. We just want to understand how voters will react to the kind of criticisms that might get raised. And you'll see here we didn't really pull any punches. We said we don't want to have higher taxes, the economy isn't strong enough to bear this, we don't want to add more bureaucracy, government may waste the money, we're touching on a bunch of raw nerves that we know from the data I've already shown you are things that are concerns for voters locally. And again, these are ranked in the order in which voters labeled them very convincing reasons to vote no. So here you'll see the numbers on the no side. I mentioned a few moments ago that items that at least 40% rate as very convincing, we consider to be pretty powerful arguments. And on the no side, there's a range that are either at or above that threshold. And you'll remember before, we saw the positive arguments bumped our support up slightly, but these negative arguments really did narrow the gap. Still left us with a majority that were in favor of a measure, but there's no question that these kinds of criticisms do have an impact on voters' willingness to vote yes. And once again here, you'll see just another review of those numbers. So that takes us to our conclusion. And the bottom line here is there seems to be a reasonably solid majority constituency that is in favor of this idea, but it's one that obviously is narrow enough that it needs to be approached with some caution. We have a majority that are in favor. It's within the margin of error. It does seem to expand a little bit when we let people know what the cost impact is. That $29 per year figure seems to make them a little bit more comfortable. And we've got a range of messages that are helpful, talking about future generations, conservation of natural areas, protecting water quality, but there's not as much urgency around the reasons to vote yes as there is around the reasons to vote no. We saw there was a stronger emotional reaction and it led those numbers to drop a little bit. So what this says is obviously this is sort of right on the cusp. To be successful, you need to be confident that moving forward you would be able to sort of bring together a coalition of community members who are supportive, who would be interested in doing the public education that would be necessary to sort of reinforce the instincts of some of those voters who tell us they vote yes, but are a little bit uncertain in that prospect at first. Do you guys know if there's anything you want to add?
And just a reminder that this was countywide.
Yeah.
That when I was here earlier in the year, and with the help of Commissioner Jeffries, who the board had put on point to work with us, as well as many of the community members in this room today, helped craft the poll to look at a countywide MPD. So that was the premise that we started with to test. And those are the results. I know, Commissioner, you and I had a discussion a month or so ago, about some other concepts. That's not the premise that we started with, and so those, the sample size for some of those answers, it's a different sample size and a higher margin of error, but.
Well, one of the things I plan to do, I don't see him here actually, he was just here, hilarious. Monty had asked that I put together a meeting with him and some of those that are organized up there in the north to see if they can open their minds a little bit about going a little further. I can see some of the benefits that would sell greatly, being able to talk about lighted facilities, be able to talk about playgrounds, as I just shared this morning with the commission. Actual playgrounds, a place to have a picnic and stuff, might have to play well, but that has yet to be worked out.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have, I saw that you measured support via commissioner district. Did you break it down even further at all as far as responses? I know that the margin of error is going to be a lot higher, but.
We don't have it already broken down that way, but we certainly can. We know the
Okay.
precinct of everyone that we interviewed, and so we can
Okay.
sort of slice and dice those in whatever way would be helpful.
Okay, and did you, I can't remember, was it 1 or 2 or 4 voters?
I think it was anyone who had voted in one of the last 6 primary or general elections, plus anyone who had registered to vote since November of 2014,
Okay.
which for a presidential
Pretty
election
broad
is the
sweep,
standard model we're using, yeah.
Because we're looking at 80% turnout, given an all vote by mail state, we're really looking at very high turnout for this November 8th, and I think that was, you know, one of the things that Commissioner Shelton had said before, you know, let as many people vote as possible. We also have found, I mean, we think that this is due diligence, working with the electorate to understand what it is they do and don't want. So having maximum voters participate really is information we're trying to convey to you in turn.
So, you know, Dave, you were pretty qualified in your approach towards, you know, would you make a recommendation? So I'm gonna either ask both of you or individually, would you make a recommendation, we put this on the ballot?
I will start with, again, the premise that we came into this with a year and a half ago, which was to look at dedicated funding countywide, you know, to help with dedicated funding in an MPD. Does that, you know, potentially free up other funding, whether it's for potholes or whether it's for education or whether it's for public safety? So the idea was to be able to, you know, see what might be countywide potential. Realizing that frankly, this set of commissioners and your prior colleagues have been very, have been generous in terms of funding. But this, we also, the reason we do this work is we know that voters, if they have a funding mechanism like an MPD or Conservation Futures, if they want to seize the opportunity and tax themselves for dedicated funding for conservation, that really, frankly, eases your burden as elected officials in having to balance an annual budget. So the idea was to see, is there enough? And these numbers countywide, you know, are not as strong as we would like to see. We like to see a 10% cushion. So-called pocketbook measures only have a tendency to go down. They don't rise. There are exceptions to that, but starting at 55% doesn't give you much margin, and you can see if those negative arguments do have any push or weight behind them. We approach, you know, 50-50. We approach 50-50. So.
What is the number that we spend on parks right now?
550,000.
550,000? Does that include all wages, all everything, or what do we have?
That's everything.
So essentially, and the reason we all of us who worked on this, Commissioner, in the poll chose the 20 cents per thousand, if that is fully assessed and collected, which, as we've established, is not.
No, it's still, that's a positive of 500K.
Yes, exactly.
So-
That's where I was going with that, yes.
That's what I was looking at to see, you know, it's one thing to do it, is it beneficial? Do they go backwards? Do they gain? 500K a year is a lot to, or things can occur with that. Still needs county and stuff, probably do granting and go after some of that.
Any other questions? Do you want to ask the audience? Is there anybody in the audience that has any questions for Dee or David?
Is it-
Just one, would you consider it would then be the 3 commissioners that would be the park director or Metropolitan Park seated positions? Or would you go to having, whatever, five citizens that come forward and put their name on the ballot at the same time you put the ballot measure forward.
I see more of that than I do the other. I'm not a big fan of the commission one, but that's just my own personal belief, but there'd have to be some type of protection.
Somebody shared with me, and I didn't go back and double check the RCWs, that wasn't a possibility to have a voted in Parks Commission.
Yeah, it'd be one of the two possibilities.
Okay, I was misled then, because that's where I kept going on, and then somebody came back to me and said that's not correct, and I didn't go back and check the
Well,
RCW.
just so you know, the parks thing is different than most of them. Automatically, if you're telling me that disclaimer that you put for the ballot is doable, then it's already different than it would be for creating another district. Because most districts, you can't put that. In order to create the district, those that are elected in as a board have to decide the actual amount. There's a limit of which they can decide up to, but you can't make that decision through ballot. You can't otherwise say, I'm going to create a hospital district and only charge 20 cents. That wasn't allowed by state.
But this is the creation of a initial district, and along with that creation, you would also, have to run your 5
He's talking
potential
about that,
candidates.
now he's talking about the levy.
The levy rate.
Yeah, I know, but you have to have that to establish your district.
Yeah, no, I know, that's what I'm saying. So I've never seen it to where we've used the number in the actual ballot amount, or ballot thing. And yes, at the same time, if it was done like a recreation port district or a hospital district, then you have to have your people on the ballot for the same one. They're the ones who make the decision on the actual compensation amount, not the ballot. But it may be different for parks, so.
Yeah, we specifically look at the enabling authority for metropolitan park districts, and so I can't speak to hospitals, jails, and other sorts of
No, it just means I have to learn
districts.
more. That's all that means.
And that's
Well, that's in
part of what's
feasibility
in
study.
the.
Are you able to
E7.
summarize, so we would have to go to the ballot with 2 questions, or actually 6 questions of who, shall there be one? And shall these people be the commissioners, or do you wait?
If it was done in that
Period.
manner.
Yeah, I think first, and Jessica, who does research with our program, might be able to, I think it's 2 separate questions, and they can both be on at the same time, on the ballot at the same time. But one is for, and that's probably what you did, Mark, isn't it? Yeah, when the MPD was
Our
created.
ballot language specifically stated that the city commission would serve as the ex officio board.
Yeah.
If you're electing a park board, I think per the RCW, they have to be elected at a time.
At the
The
same
ballot
time, yes.
measure is because you need somebody to run the park district if it doesn't pass.
Right.
Yes.
But you all, as the elected body, would determine, I mean, it's your referral of any measure to the ballot. So you would determine at the time you referred a measure whether or not it was an independently elected board or if you served as the governing body,
Do you have the RCW by chance?
probably.
4661.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, 3561.
City?
Title 35. Yeah, there's some restrictions around whether or not it's a county, city combined, or county alone and unincorporated versus, there's some distinctions there.
Yeah.
Right, and Commissioner Jeffries, it's a year ago now, you reached out to Municipal Research, and I think it was either 4, this hasn't been done before, there were 5 separate options
Right.
on how to approach merging. So if you chose to go that route, and if the city.
Because that's probably the code you just cited is the city code, not the county code.
I got the RCWs, but
Yeah.
I didn't bring them with me.
No, it'll be
I got
under
them worked out.
36, but I can find it, but that's one problem though, because that may be how it's set up for city, and believe me, there's one thing we've learned, it's a lot different between the 2 entities.
Yeah.
The way the law has it set, things set up. So yeah, I'll find that, don't worry about it.
It should be 35.61. State.
3669 is ours.
so yeah, so, no, I mean, I think that's part of the discussion of, first, do we go forward? Secondly, how would we go forward? Thirdly, is there this attempt to annex in the city of Shelton or be annexed by the city of Shelton? Because now we have a question to go before the city of Shelton voters, it's a separate question. And so this is pretty complicated as far as how it would be, so I think that just the general direction, do we go forward and then we dice and slice what it looks like, because there's a lot of questions, and it's a heavy lift as far as getting forward this November ballot, especially if if it's a separately elected commission, by the commission.
Do you know timing on that?
I know that you have to decide by August.
Yeah, it's all in the feasibility report, and the deadline for,
Whenever the August primary is.
August 2nd.
August 2nd. So it's the same date as the August primary. That we would have had to make the actions, and so that these.
And if we pass this year, and she predicted 60% of our voters would probably vote in this, so
80.
80.
Oh, Mason County voters? Wow.
I'm glad you said that, because when she said that number, I about choked over here. It just doesn't happen.
No,
I'd love to see that.
I was statewide, 80% statewide.
So then it really, in the year of 17, we'd have to meet that number of voters to be able to validate in the year of 17 if we moved it 1 year, correct? You're bearing off of.
Oh, good, is
vote.
it a percentage of the voters that voted in the last election?
Yeah,
Just a
usually.
simple majority.
Well, one of the things I'm finding right now is we need to look, because at the county, but remember, I'm just doing it on my phone, guys. I'm trying to do the best that I can, but I'm not seeing a legislative option. The only thing I'm seeing so far is a petition option. We included hearing on petition, boundaries, election. So far, I haven't seen in the county, the number that you're specifying is for the city. 35 is cities, 36 is counties,
The title.
the RCWs. The 35 is cities, 36 is counties. Under the counties, park and recreation districts.
Shall be initiated by petition.
Yeah.
Did they mention counties?
No,
in
it's
35?
Are you-
cities and/or counties in Washington may create a metropolitan park district for the management, control, improvement, maintenance, and acquisition of parks, parkways, boulevards, and rec facilities. A metropolitan park district may include territory located in portions or all of one or more cities or counties, or one or more cities and counties.
Yeah, we're allowed to do it, but how to do it? I'm just, like I said, I'm not trying to add nothing to this, guys. I'm trying to find the answers.
What's the RCW you're looking at?
3669
That's the counties.
Could you take a look at that?
020.
Ms. Researcher?
So you're saying by petition, that means we'd have to get a citizen's petition?
There are park districts and then there are metropolitan park districts, so maybe it might be that word that's different.
Well, metropolitan usually means city.
No, Metropolitan just.
It's a weird word, yeah.
But right now, the thing I'm looking at is the 36. Do you see another one in there that I've missed? There might be another 36. I'm just looking at the one. Like I said, I'm doing it right here. It's not like I'm taking.
36s are for parks and recreation districts. And then it
Have
references
facilities.
LIDs as well.
Yeah. We have an RCW for facilities, and we have another RCW for districts.
Well, an MPD is different from a parks district. It is a different animal. So we are talking about the 3561.
Specific legislation to metropolitan park districts, and I can't recite the code number.
Commissioner, I think you're looking at a different.
Our Ballot has done all
Yes,
this.
I'm looking at our county one.
But no, parks and recreation districts, that's very
It's-
different from a
it's
metropolitan park
Right.
district. Metropolitan park districts are authorized by counties to do, but it sits in the Title 35, not Title 36. Parks and recreation district is a whole nother animal. So yes, that's a different animal, but we were testing out on the MPDs, and that's in the Title 35.
And I have all those broken out, I just didn't bring that folder.
Okay, so,
And if I may, MRSC says that the Metropolitan Park District is authorized under 3561
yeah, so it's Parks and
Four
Recreation.
counties.
for counties.
Parks and Recreation is a different animal. Okay, so is there anything else? Okay, so I think that, we have all the information we may or may not need.
Okay.
David, I don't know if Commissioner Sheldon will ask for something more specific in your analysis.
We're happy to provide whatever
Okay,
he or either of you would like.
okay. And just for the public's knowledge, there's some discussion in the North End that it would be a North End district only. And it sounds like there's going to be some discussions to kind of maybe talk to people about expanding that. So we are right out of the chute. We have an objection to the potential formation as we have first envisioned. So that may or may not help in this discussion as well. So, I assume we would go through D if we had any questions about some of the more detailed.
Yeah, just let Dee know and she can
Okay.
relay to me whatever.
Okay. Commissioner Heldman, do you have anything else?
Good.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for coming and doing this work. Appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Thank you both.